I warn you in advance, I've got a little bit of a throat tickle, so if I have to stop and take a sip of water, I apologize for that. I'll just give you more time to think over some of these concepts. This is atypical for the type of webinars we usually give for northern grapes, because both typicity and terroir are hardly well-defined scientific concepts. They tend to be philosophical at best, and I guess philosophical at best is where I'll leave it. So what I hope to do today is give you some thoughts on what typicity is, how it relates to terroir, and how, as members of the industry in newer regions where there are grapes and styles of wines that aren't as well known, you can hopefully change the way your consumers think about typicity. If you want to, you might not. Depends on how interventionist you are. So dive right into it. I perhaps should have labeled this typicity and terroir instead of terroir and typicity, because I'd actually like to start with typicity first. Let's see. Typicity comes from this French word, not surprisingly, typicité, which might be even harder for Crystalline to pronounce than typicity itself. So typicité has been used in France traditionally to describe many sorts of products. Cheese is one that is quite familiar and forms the basis in France as well as in other EU countries of their AOC, DOC, their controlled appellation of origin. So there is some list of characteristics that are considered essential and required, in fact, for something to be designated as an AOC. And so that concept, of course, applies to wine. And as with so many other things in the U.S., when we pulled a lot of our wine drinking culture from Europe, we also grabbed this French word and de-Frenchified it pretty quick, because we don't like accents over our E's, and called it typicity, which is not originally an English word. It definitely is a borrowed word that we modified or mangled, depending on how you look at it. In the U.S., we mostly use typicity to talk about wine. We don't have the same tradition, at least recently, of other origin delimited products, although we're seeing more and more of that with artisan cheeses and other things. But we mostly hear about it in discussions of wine. So if we look at the roots of this word, we can think a little bit about some of the definitions that are involved. Typical, of course, is most related. Typicality is the closest English word to typicity, but we don't tend to use that. And words in this sort of concept cloud, a product that is typical or has typicality or typicity serves as a representation of a particular type. It tends to be characteristic. So something that we could point at and say, oh yes, that is typical of whatever. Often these are stereotypes, and sometimes this is used disparagingly. I'm sure you can think of instances. But it also, however, can be thought of as a sort of benchmarking criteria. So something that's typical exhibits essential characteristics of a group or some combination of characteristics. So we can look at something that can be identified and something that has exhibits essential characteristics of a group. Now, when we use it for wine, things get a little bit mushier. As with, say, minerality and several other wine terms that you may be familiar with, we find that people talk about or use typicity and assume that everyone knows what they mean. But when you dig a little bit deeper, there actually are several a family of related, but several different definitions or thoughts about what typicity means in wine. And the most simple, to me, is typicity as the degree to which a wine reflects its varietal origins. So something is typical of a Chardonnay if the wine that's produced tastes like a Chardonnay or a Sauvignon Blanc or whatever the grape that we are talking about is. So we could say from that, excuse me, I'm having trouble advancing the slide, that if this is a Sauvignon Blanc grape, then this wine from the Marlborough region of New Zealand shows typicity of Sauvignon Blanc. It's got some green characteristics, it's got some cat pea, it's got some tropical fruit, and therefore it shows typicity. But if you're in France, you could also run into this Sauvignon Blanc and say, oh, Sancerre, absolutely. It shows typicity of Sauvignon Blanc. It's got some tropical fruit. It's got bracing acidity. It's got some minerality. Now, the problem that we run into, of course, with these examples is that while both of these wines show typicity, the two wines themselves don't have a lot in common necessarily. Certainly they have higher acidity. They're both white wines, but they're a little bit different. So in order to encompass both of those, we might need to add on to typicity. In addition to just being an expression of the grape that the wine is made from, it also includes the quality of being typical of type, there's your grape, but also geographical provenance and even vintage year. So we could say it's typical of 2013. And on, it also has been used to include a culture, a people, and most importantly, a tradition. So the typicity of a Sancerre Sauvignon Blanc is different than the typicity of a New World Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. It reflects the culture and tradition of the winemaking there and the peoples, which are the nation, of course, where the wine was made. So we've got a broad range of what typicity means, something as simple as it shows the grape or it shows everything that's going on, which starts to sound suspiciously like terroir, which is the combination of factors including soil, climate, and season that impart sensory characteristics to a wine. And I'm sure you are all familiar with that concept. So when we start looking at things being typical of a grape or being typical of a product type, we need to think about how typicity and terroir interact. So there are two options that we can think of, and if we were sitting in a big lecture room, I would actually ask you to raise your hand to these, but I guess I'm just going to have to imagine since I can't really see that. We could say that typicity is independent of terroir in that typicity is the varietal characteristics that are going to show through regardless of where the grapes are grown. And there are people who argue strongly for this, that the typicity of Riesling is that it tends to have monoterpenes, it tends to be aromatic, it tends to have some steeliness or some minerality, and that's going to happen whether the Riesling is grown in Germany or in Austria or in Australia or in New York or in Washington State. But there's another camp that has a pretty strong voice that also would argue that typicity is in fact dependent on terroir. And that's where we start thinking about the typicity of, again, the Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc as compared to the typicity of a Sancerre. So we're adding a whole lot of additional characteristics and making the product size a little bit smaller because we're moving from just Sauvignon Blanc to Sauvignon Blanc from a certain region. And how comfortable you are with these definitions varies. I imagine if we were looking at a show of hands, we'd see about an even split with a pretty good portion of people who are now looking puzzled and going, oh, I never thought of it that way. I thought typicity was just typicity. So we've got a wide range of thoughts on the definition of this particular word. So moving on. Just to add another, not really layer, but a level of confusion to this, we also need to stop, or I'd like us to move from thinking about typicity as a product of the environment and or the grape, the source of the wine, and think from the other end of the spectrum. If we start from the consumer's point of view, we have to approach typicity a little bit differently. For every product on the shelf, including wine, there is what is called a product space when we think about consumer psychology and about marketing. And a product space is defined by a pretty strict set of discrete, often binary descriptors. Something either is a product or it isn't. It either is a Sauvignon Blanc or it's not a Sauvignon Blanc. There's no in-between. It's a binary distinction. But every product also has got what's called sensory space. And sensory space is much less discrete. Sensory space exists along a continuum where a given product will have more sugar, more acidity, less lime character, a range of pineapple character, many things. Nothing is either or, either there or not. It's much broader. You either have different quantities of this. And where things get interesting for folks who are trying to talk about typicity of wine is where we see the product space overlapping with the sensory space. What we're looking for are wines that we know are within the category that we are talking about, in this case, say, Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough, and then we want to try to define the sensory space of this product by the things that are most typical or found in most of the wines that we would categorize in this product space. Hope that doesn't get too confusing, but we're looking for this overlapping area in the Venn diagram, basically. And there is actually a way to do this. Since the early 2000s, Jordi Ballester and Yves Lefeur, who both work at the University of Burgundy and INRA in Dijon, have actually defined a typicity method. And I'm showing you some of their data here. This is one of the early studies where they were actually looking at the typicity of Chardonnay from the Chablis region or subregion of Burgundy. And if you're interested in sort of understanding what the different wines are, if you look along the horizontal axis, the wines are coded by a letter and a number. Each letter is the name of the grape, so anything that has a C is a Chardonnay. But it's really essential here to realize that in order to pick things out as typical or define them as typical of a class, we have to compare them to things that are not typical. And often that means things that are outside the class, so that you have a decent line for comparing those two things. So in this particular study, they compared Chardonnays from Chablis with several other wines from Chablis. So you may see S, which would be Sauvignon, or B, which is Melon de Bourgogne. There's some other cultivars in there as well. So if you look along the scale, the wines that have the lowest typicity of Chardonnay from Chablis are on the left, and the ones with the highest are on the right. And you do notice that on the right, to the right of that gray barred out area, you see more Chardonnays, and to the left you see far fewer Chardonnays. So what Ballester and Lefeur propose that we do is remove the average wines from the middle, take all the ones from the right that are most typical, and those are the ones that we're going to use for sensory description, because those are the ones that are going to reflect what sensorially is typical in these wines, whether they are Chardonnay or not. Now, one thing that's pretty interesting to me, if you look here, they're primarily Chardonnays, but you see three grapes, two of them Melon de Bourgogne, that B3 and B2, that are actually apparently quite typical of Chardonnays from Chablis, but aren't actually Chardonnays from Chablis. They're something else from Chablis. So as you can see, it's not a discrete characteristic. It's quite mushy. So things starts to sound less scientific and more philosophical right there. So what we would then do is take these particular wines, we would give them blind to a group of tasters, and we would go through all of the steps of descriptive analysis or other methods for getting descriptors, so that we could put together a lexicon of things and say, well, yes, you know, Chardonnays from Chablis are more or less fruity, have more or less of this characteristic, and so on. Now, one thing that can get people's nose out of joint is the thought, who judges typicity? And we all say, well, of course I do. I've tasted enough wines. I know what's typical. But when we're looking at sensory studies like this, the correct answer for who can judge typicity is that the experts do. Because the experts, whoever we define as an expert, are the people who both have tasted many more wines than the rest of us, and so have a better handle on the whole pool of wines that are out there, and also are the ones who are pretty much going to dictate to the rest of the world what the typical aromas and flavors of this wine class are. All of the names you see here, Robert Parker and so on, are certainly folks who have done that in our world. But the place where we, from a consumer point of view or a marketing point of view, as winemakers in regions that are not as well developed, are both handicapped and empowered, is the fact that the experts don't know a lot about what Frontenac, Le Crescent, Brianna, and other cold climate, or if you're not in a cold climate, whatever your developing region is doing best. In fact, you may still be debating what wine grape is best in your region. I noticed we had folks say from North Carolina and some other places in the the sort of mid-Atlantic regions, and in a lot of that area, we're still trying to figure out what the best red or white is for a particular region. So there's a lot of education that has to happen, and the best way to do that, I think, is to meet with other winemakers, taste through all of your products, and agree on at least a small selection of lexicon that you think is appropriate, that you think defines your product, and start pushing that. Because the more times they see Frontenac has cherry flavors in it, the more that's going to sink into the consciousness of both your consumers and of the folks who are going to be writing about your wine, so that you can sort of mold the descriptors that are out there, and we don't get a lot of, oh, this wine is too acidic, this wine is very herbaceous, and those are the primary things that we're known for. So handicap, because people are unfamiliar with your wines, but also a potential marketing. Sounds a little, I guess, underhanded if you would like to just let the wine rest on its own, but do you really want to wait 200 years to find out what a typical Frontenac is? Maybe not. So there's some area for manipulation there. Now, if you wanted to do a very typical or robust study to try to get some scientific, as scientific as we can get with this, agreement on what is typical of a wine, there are some steps you can take. What you want to do, of course, is decide who your experts are. And in a study that we've done actually in the Finger Lakes here with our Riesling, we decided that our winemakers, in fact, were the experts. We got a bunch of them together. We gave them wines from the region. That we made them taste them blind, and we asked them to just rank them for typicity. And if anyone's interested in this method, I would be glad to give you any of the information. Just email me or Chrislyn, and we can get that paper and some other information out to you. So you can ask your winemakers to rank the typicity of the wine. Blind, of course, they don't know their own wines, we hope. And if you have a big enough group and tasters who are experienced enough, you will get hopefully a pretty good idea of what at least your winemakers think is typical. You can also do this with wine writers in your area or wine purchasers, but you need to make sure that they are familiar enough with the categories. And again, that's where we get in a little bit of a pinch, because there just aren't enough of the cold hardy wines, at least, out there for us to do this. And if there are, they're very locally distributed. So getting a lot of wines from, say, New England over to the upper Midwest or vice versa hampers our ability to taste across regions. Right now, we probably could go within a state and get a pretty good collection of, say, wines from Quebec or wines from Minnesota, but trying to get all of those together in one place in an organized fashion for a blind tasting can be a bit of a challenge. So that's something scientifically that I would like to do in the future, but we probably are a few years out before we can do that in an organized way. So you'll give your experts the wines blind. You would ask them to go through the same process that happened in the Chablis study, and then would take the wines away from them and get a trained panel, a non-expert group of wine tasters to taste the wines blind and generate the descriptors. You do need 2 panels for this because we can't use the same group because of various reasons, mostly expertise and benchmarking issues and learned response to wines. We can't use the same group for both of these, but this is something that we have done in New York. It can be done. It's just a lot of work. So it may not be something that you want to do within your region just yet. We do, however, because of the Northern Grape projects and some other studies, we've got some nice starting points for people who want to try to, if you'd like to try to get a lexicon that you and your colleagues can agree upon when you're talking to your consumers, give you a place to sort of like get a handle on wines. Morley Damadakari and his student Jennifer Savitz did some studies on Le Crescent. Here's portion of their data reprinted from Ginny's dissertation from Iowa State. She looked at Le Crescent grapes in Iowa, made some wines, compared them to a Moscato. So there's your example of something that's outside of the product definition to see how it compares. And compared a commercial Le Crescent with some research Le Crescent wine. She did this for a couple of years. Now, something interesting that I haven't shown you here is that there was quite a difference in intensity of each of these individual descriptors, pineapple, melon, lychee, grapefruit, apricot, and rose for each year. So we are seeing variation in intensity, but she did get this lexicon developed, and that can be a starting point for you with the crescent. I believe she's done similar work with Frontenac Gris. Way back when I was at the University of Minnesota many years ago, we did similar work with Frontenac. So there is a sort of a base lexicon for Frontenac, but at the time I could only get my hands on 8 commercial Frontenac wines. So that's a very small pool. So for both this study of Ginny's and for Frontenac and any other grape, we need to have a much broader scale before we try to develop a lexicon that covers the whole range of wines that are out there, and before we start narrowing down what's typical of these particular grapes. One thing that's interesting to me is, for instance, when we talk to folks in warmer areas like southern Missouri who are growing Frontenac Gris, we're hearing that there's a lot more Sauvignon Blanc-like characteristics that come out that ripen in warmer weather. We don't see that necessarily in the cooler climates in the upper Midwest or in excuse me, I got distracted by a note from Grisland in Vermont. So there's a range that we don't quite have yet. So we need to have a much broader production before we can really expand this, but we can start. So again, once you decide you want to do this as a group, you would pick a category, say all red wines made from Frontenac, and could just decide that you put together a lexicon and a list of descriptors for Frontenac, or you could go from there after getting, say, a general for all Frontenac. You could decide, well, we're just going to look at Frontenacs from Vermont, and then potentially compare and contrast that with Frontenacs from other regions. And one thing I will say, if you are in near Minnesota and we're planning on going to the Minnesota Grape Growers Association Cold Climate Conference at I guess it's the middle of February, we are going to have a Northern Grapes wine tasting there, where we will be tasting wines from yeast trials where we made wines from cold hardy grapes that were sourced from Minnesota, Vermont, and also Northern New York, made under the same circumstances with the same yeast. So the only variable is region, and that is one of the, it's like a 2-hour tasting session that you can register for, although it is limited space. So that may be of interest if you would like to personally experience one of the broader tastings that we're able to pull together. I will be gathering data from that tasting as well. So if you want to be part of the group that perhaps helps to decide what characteristics are common across the board, you're welcome to do that. We did an earlier tasting of wines made a few years ago in Vermont and upstate New York for the group there, and interestingly enough found that there wasn't a preference in yeast. So region was what dictated preference. So we may have a little bit of some cellar palate going on there, where folks who are familiar with their own wines liked them better than ones from other regions, which also can confound our ability to develop these lexicons. So let's back up a bit. The things that make up typicity, if we start with the simplest definition and decide that typicity is similar to or greatly tied to varietal character, or the character from the grape, we need to think for a minute about how we define varietal character. So if you come to other of my talks, you may have seen this before. Right now, the predominant theory on wine aroma and wine flavor chemistry comes from Vicente Ferreira from Zaragoza, Spain. It's the flavor buffer theory. And in the flavor buffer theory, Vicente and his group propose that there is a set of compounds, including ethanol and 22 others, that are going to occur in any wine you ever make anywhere, at least out of grapes. And that the aroma of all of these compounds, while relatively strong, when you smell them, all they tell your brain is that, oh, here's wine. We have made wine. So when you taste a wine that is generally vinous, as people say, doesn't have a lot of typicity or varietal character, it's this collection of compounds that you are smelling for the most part. In order for a wine to elicit more of a response from you, it needs to have appreciable quantities of what the flavor buffer theory calls impact odorants, or compounds that are able to punch through that baseline of the flavor buffer and actually smell different. So for instance, if you smell a wine and you get a smell of green pepper, if you are a trained wine taster or a wine taster who's been around the block, you're going to go, oh yeah, Cabernet, because I smell green pepper, since you know it's not green pepper wine. So that is one of the simplest examples of an impact odorant, because it's a single compound or often a single compound that smells like this green pepper aroma, and it's characteristic of both Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc for the most part. More commonly, it's not a single compound that we're looking at. It is more often a collection of compounds in various ratios, which is why it's hard for us to say, you know, green pepper is what smells like Cabernet, and these 15 compounds in this ratio is what smells like Riesling. Although we do know families of compounds, of course, monoterpenes have been found in Le Crescent and are probably what give Le Crescent their varietal character. They also have been found in Riesling and in Gewürztraminer, and so on. We're still looking for impact odorants in Frontenac, Le Crescent, and Marquette, as well as the Elmer Swenson cultivars. So we don't have, those are probably combinations of compounds rather than individual ones. In fact, I would say they absolutely are, without, you know, I'll go out on a limb and say that we're not going to find one compound that makes Brianna smell like Brianna. So if we think of it that way, we also need to realize that within the grape, there are many compounds that have the potential to evoke varietal character, but they're not showing their full potential when they're sitting in the grape. For instance, you can't take a grape, taste it, and have it taste like Le Crescent. At least not like Le Crescent wine. So if we think of the grape sort of like a caterpillar that we know needs to go through some transformation to show its glory, if you have ever judged at the Minnesota State Fair, that might be giving you flashbacks to this wine that comes from northern Minnesota, but we will just go on by that and say that that's not what we're dealing with here. If our much like this caterpillar that needs to go through a mute phase in order to turn into the desired butterfly, our wine needs to go through some processing steps in order to reach the final stage of the wine, where we can see all of the expression of all of these compounds that were chemically or physically bound in the grape. So the processing methods that we use to make the wine certainly will influence the perception of varietal character. It'll influence the things that are released from the grape, and as such, we have to decide whether the decisions that we're making are going to help enhance typicity, whatever we decided that is, whether they're actually a part of typicity. For instance, barrel fermented Chardonnay from California typically has got some oak flavor because that's how that category has typically developed. So we still have a lot of leeway with this when we're talking about new wine grapes, because we've only been making wine with them for a few decades rather than a few centuries, or just a few years even with some of them. So we need to think about how these processing methods change precursors in the grape, whether they philosophically fit with your idea of what should be a typical expression of this grape, or whether they're a variation that defines perhaps your individual style. So as I mentioned before, the IBMP, which is the compound, the methoxypyrazine, that gives you the green pepper, that is something that if it's in the grape, it's going to be in the wine. It doesn't age out, as you can see in this study from my colleague Gavin Sachs and his student Bruce Pan. What was there in 2008 was measured also in 2009. So if you've got that green pepper, you've got the green pepper. That's a part of the varietal typicity, or the varietal character, that's going to be part of the typicity of your wine. There are other compounds that we can modify as early as in the vineyard. And so the traditional viticultural practices are things that also we need to take into account. I think, for instance, right now in Minnesota, I believe there's some argument about whether we should be growing Frontenac on VSP or on high wire bilateral cordon. Those tend to change some of the characteristics, or so I have heard. So we need to think about those effects as well. In this example that I'm showing you, TDN is the compound that in Riesling produces the traditional kerosene note that is prized in many German Rieslings, but often is not appreciated, say, in ones from Washington State or from New York, but it depends on who you talk to. And in a study by my colleagues Justin Van den Heuvel and Gavin Sachs, we found that TDN actually is higher when we remove leaf, practice leaf removal pre-veraison. So the earlier we get those leaves off, the higher TDN as the wine ages. Is this typicity in the grape, varietal character? Well, yes, because the precursors are in the grape, but we had to intervene as humans in order to express that compound, or on the contrary, try to not express those compounds. So early decisions can make an impact. Incidentally, there are also studies on leaf removal and methoxypyrazines that you can reference on Cornell's webpage as well. Another one that's quite interesting to me is the development of volatile thiols. A lot of the work on the volatile thiols has been done in Sauvignon Blanc in New Zealand by Tabanaga et al. He has a series of articles. And they're quite an interesting group of compounds because they develop, peak, and start to recede within a 2-week period towards the end of harvesting. That 2-week period is going to change, towards the end of ripening. That 2-week period is going to change based on the region, the microclimate, the vine health, and also the particular conditions of a harvest year. So you've got a 2-week window that is moving around, and in order to get the most expression of these varietal character compounds, because these are the things that give you cat pea, grapefruit, mango, papaya, and other sort of those sulfur-based tropical fruits in Sauvignon Blanc, you have to hit the right harvesting period. Another thing that's interesting with this particular family of compounds is that the time that the grapes were transported, whether the drive from the vineyard to the winery was an hour or 4 hours, also impacted the concentration of the compounds. So there's some sort of activity going on that is causing those to develop over time. So both harvest time and also post-harvest treatment can potentially affect these compounds, which arguably reflect varietal typicity. At this point, we have not positively identified volatile thiols in any of the cold hardy grapes, but there is some evidence, again, because as I reported, we have heard that there are more Sauvignon Blanc-like characteristics developing in Frontenac Gris grown in warmer climates. There may be some of these in Frontenac Gris. So you have to decide, is this part of the typicity of the grape? We can release volatile thiols with some yeast strains that are able to cleave these compounds. So if you have a pool of them there, they could be released. What do you think? How do you want to define the volatile thiol characteristic? There are also some compounds that form through processing and growth that are just part of the flavor buffer. So light exposure gives you more nor-isoprenoids. These are compounds that tend to taste like honey, taste or smell like honey or pineapple. Some of the more generic, less sulfury tropical fruits. So light exposure may enhance this flavor buffer, which may actually tamp down varietal character or typicity if you're trying to push that through. On the other hand, esters are either formed or released primarily during fermentation, and yeast strain has a huge impact on which esters are formed and which esters persist. They also change over the course of aging. The esters that form during fermentation are largely not they're largely gone, for lack of a better word, after about 18 months of aging, sometimes as early as 6 months, and are transformed into other aroma compounds. So all of that pool changes based on your yeast and processing. So at this point, if we pause and sort of think again about typicity of a wine. Again, our base argument was, well, typicity is just how well we express the varietal character, but we know that varietal character now can be influenced both by the type of grape itself. Again, that methoxypyrazine is either going to be there or it isn't. The way it's grown, light exposure, can impact some of our compounds, some of which are ones that we want, say the TDN and a German Riesling, and also the way we process the grapes, cold soak, hot press, maceration, other things that pull out different compounds. So could we argue that the grape itself plus the way it's grown plus all processing methods equal typicity, or are now we getting a little too specific? It's up to you. Or is this typicity by terroir? Do we start with the base level of typicity, this is what's in the grape, and terroir is what influences the expression of that typicity? So when I'm talking about a Merlot, or excuse me, a Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc versus a Sancerre Sauvignon Blanc, the typicity is the things that's common, and the terroir is the overlay of influences that changes that. Again, philosophical question, I'm afraid. But we certainly know there are certainly processing methods that steps that we take that we need to think about in terms of how stringently we want to cling to purity of terroir or not, and purity of varietal expression. For instance, acid reduction. If you are growing your grapes in a cooler climate, you likely are going to have more acidity. There's more acidity in a Riesling from cooler parts of Germany than there is in one grown in Washington State. And those at this point are considered typical of the region, but some people still want to modify that, and so they do. If we are looking at hybrid grapes that have a high level of acid, do we want to try to go through malolactic fermentation, as I've sort of fancifully depicted here? Do we want to instead try to do chemical deacidification so that we get that lucrescent down to something more akin to a Riesling? Or is that acidity, that refreshing, bracing, and or offensive acidity, depending on your point of view, something that we want to embrace? And that's an interesting question. The acidity, I think, is probably not as big a debate as some other factors, but it's certainly one that we need to think about. Tannin additions, I think, are one that should be of interest right now in our red wines, because we've certainly seen some recent studies coming out from northern grapes and from some other work here at Cornell that tannins are inherently low in many hybrid grapes, and that not only are they low, but the ones that are there are really, really hard to extract. So we inherently have got grapes that are both low tannin, and when we try to add tannin additions back to them, they're going to suck up those tannins as well and cause them to precipitate from solution. So trying to make a very high tannin red from grapes that are both inherently low tannin and which also are never naturally going to have a high level of tannin could arguably be less than an expression of the terroir. On the other hand, we have lots of wine drinkers who are used to drinking wines that are not, light acidic reds. Do we need to modify to meet their taste, or do we need to come up with a new definition, a new typicity of what these red wines should be, and push that in terms of fruitiness, acidity, other food pairings, instead of trying to say, well, it's kind of like a Pinot Noir, but with less tannin, or something like that. Do we want to compare? Do we want to start a new description and a new idea of typicity? Open for debate, and something that you should probably be talking about with your regional colleagues. Barrel aging, similar argument. We certainly are very, very comfortable with barrel aging in wine production. It's something we've been doing for ages. Although I got an interesting argument with a sommelier who was a wine purist who said, never should we ever flavor wines, ever, no flavoring. So adding toasted oak chips, that's flavoring. I'm like, well, what about barrels? Because that's flavoring. It's legal flavoring for us, but if we all had concrete tanks and glass back in the day, we never would have used barrels and never would have gotten used to that oak taste. Oak certainly is traditional in many regions. Again, the barrel fermented Chardonnay that I mentioned. Do you want to impose it upon the light fruity wines that you're making? Do you want to try to make a barrel fermented? Is that within the acceptable idea of typicity and terroir? I'd say at this point probably yes. It's such an accepted means of making wine that it's not something that somebody's going to feel is artificial if you use it with a new grape in a new region. Certainly barrel fermented Chardonnay with the high oak only came about in the 70s and 80s, but just for point of argument, it's another variable that we're adding. Yan adjustment is one that is certainly very controversial. If you talk to traditional winemakers in many parts of Europe, they will tell you that the yan, that is the yeast assimilable nitrogen, or the nitrogen available to the yeast, which it needs to keep from being slow or from the fermentation from sticking, inherent yan is your terroir, and messing with that is just messing with nature. We shouldn't be doing it. But we also know that if yan levels are too low, we can get stuck fermentation, and nobody would argue, I think, that H2S is a character that we want. Also, yan is so variable, both by cultivar, by region, by year. We see year-to-year variation that is tenfold. It's insane for the same grape in the same vineyard. Also, the same grape in different places tends to be much different. When we're growing Frontenac, for instance, in upstate New York, on land that has much lower previous use than the ones that we see growing in Iowa, where we're often on old farmland, there's a whole lot more nitrogen in the Midwest grapes than there are in the ones that are grown in the regions around here. So during fermentation, we get different amino acids from that yan being converted into different aroma compounds, and that changes the potential perception of typicity, doesn't it? But if we don't have a set yan, if there's not a varietal specific yan, it becomes more of a terroir issue than it becomes a typicity issue, I think. As an enology extension person, I'm always going to tell you that you need to measure your yan and make sure it's sufficient in order to get the fermentation that you want, and not have a stuck fermentation. But many people who are doing spontaneous fermentations are going to deal with the yan, just go with what they've got as well. Just as a side note, if you didn't hear or haven't looked at any of our previous research on yan, many of the grapes that we've looked at from the cold climate regions do have sufficient yan. Even the ones that are lower, like from New York and from Vermont and the New England area, while much lower than what we're seeing in the Midwest on the old farmland, it is still acceptable. So if you are not able to measure your yan, I would not decide that you need to do prophylactic additions unless you start to see a problem with fermentation. But it is something to be aware of, and if you can measure it, I would recommend that you do. All right, so those are the things we can add. One big thing that we tend to add to wine is, of course, yeast. And I'm going to spend a little more time on the yeast because this is an area of a lot of discussion right now. And this picture is actually not of bacteria and yeast. It's actually of pollen, but I thought they were much prettier than the bacteria. So there's a look at some pollen for you in your microterroir slide. All right, microterroir. What we're mostly talking about with microterroir are yeast and bacteria. And in order to get our head around the argument, we need to first figure out where yeast comes from. And this has been an area of a lot of study recently, both in new and old world regions. Because, we always said, well, it's on the grape. It's that, that cloudy stuff that we see on the skin of the grape. And that, of course, is just a waxy cuticle, which sometimes carries some yeast, but primarily doesn't. In fact, it serves to sort of protect the grapes from microbial intervention. So, does it come from the vineyard? Well, there are lots of studies on spontaneous fermentation that would suggest that that's true, because grapes have been harvested from the vineyard, pressed under sterile conditions using equipment that was clean, put into sealed containers, and it's still fermented with no yeast added. Also, we've done the same thing. Established vineyard, crushed the grapes, put them in tanks in a brand new winery, and voila, we got fermentation in an area where, when sampled previously, we found no yeast strains. Been really well cleaned, there was nothing there. So yeast kind of happens when we just bring the grapes in from the vineyard, which gives you the argument that, yeah, there's enough going on in the vineyard, even if we can't always culture it from the grapes, that we've got fermentation going on. But there are also studies that suggest this isn't the case. Again, as I mentioned, it's very hard to find high numbers of yeast, at least culturable yeast on grapes, unless that grape has been damaged previously. So unless there's a bird injury or something else that allows juice to appear, we don't see huge colonies of yeast cells, at least not Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the yeast we want. So the other argument is, well, clearly it comes from the winery, right? We've been making wine in there for years or decades or centuries. Even if we clean really well, that stuff builds up. And that's true. In most wineries, especially in older wineries, we can get pretty good collections of yeast, even in a very clean area. And in something like this, I mean, you can look, we've got barrels that have all kinds of nooks and crannies to hide in. There's a floor that is not a smooth surface, that has nooks and crannies and a floor drain that I can't get into to clean. There is most likely yeast living in this particular cellar. But we also find that it may come along in the processing as well. We've seen that yeast that are, that grapes that are sampled in the vineyard and have no yeast somehow magically start to grow yeast, or at least have cultivable yeast colonies after transport, even though they didn't in the vineyard. So again, yeast hang on. They can live in all kinds of interesting places. So we sometimes can get them in bins, in trucks, in pickers, and things that move from winery to winery. So you may be sharing your neighbor's yeast if you're sharing their equipment, whether you want to or not. Whether that affects your fermentation depends, but that is certainly a possibility. So often the argument that we get, or at least one that I've heard, is that, well, you're not really reflecting the terroir of your region if you are adding yeast, because the yeast you're adding is cultured. Of course, all cultured commercial yeast are natural, and they have been isolated from wine-producing regions like Burgundy or Barolo or things like that, Champagne. So they are legit natural yeast. They aren't GMOs. None of them are GMOs, but they weren't from your region, so that's just not natural enough for you to be terroir-driven, right? So a colleague of mine, Katie Heima, did an interesting study in Missouri where she looked at the yeast strains that existed in wineries in Missouri, in the vineyards surrounding the wineries, and at other vineyards that the wineries used, and also in the trees on the perimeter. Because in the wild, without vineyards and wineries around, we find the most Saccharomyces cerevisiae on oak trees, often on red oak trees, on the exudate, on the sort of the sap that can come out of the leaves and the trees. Those particular cultures don't survive in very high alcohol, but they do survive and can be used to make wine, although Katie will tell you the wine she made was disgusting because they do tend to stick and belch out lots of stinky compounds and not be the most delicious thing. So the Saccharomyces cerevisiae that we're looking for that have high alcohol tolerance do not seem to occur naturally on trees in the United States. So a European who once told me, yeah, we can't really make terroir-driven wine in the U.S. because we have no natural yeast, has got something of a case there because the stuff that we can identify at least is not going to be happy in the vineyard. But, or excuse me, in a winery making wine. But one thing that Katie's study found that was really interesting was that the yeast strain that was in the vineyard that was surviving almost always was very closely related to whatever yeast strains had been used in the winery. So things that could be cultured and identified in the vineyards also could be cultured and identified in the winery. And most of them, actually pretty much all of them, were also related to known commercial strains with a few genetic changes. And if you don't know, yeast is super mutable genetically. It will change genes because it reproduces pretty rapidly and gene modifications can happen quite rapidly. You'll get X degree of variation from the original yeast pretty quickly. So what we were seeing was that wines, or that yeast, were being brought in commercially, were very happy in the winery, and then as we sent trucks, pickers, lugs, everything out, in and out of vineyards, we were moving some of those yeasts to the vineyards where they were surviving. But the interesting thing was that they were also doing some gene recombination with these oak tree strains. So we were getting differences and mutations, and even though they were related to the original yeast strain over time, they were not necessarily going to act the same way. So you might have gotten a fermentation that, because of the original Saccharomyces ancestry went pretty well as far as alcohol tolerance, but because of these oak tree strains, the genes that had been transferred from that, you got some different and interesting aromas and flavors. So there's no funding to look at that study any further, but we have the potential here for sort of developing a hybrid yeast, I guess, that is typical to a very small microclimate like a winery or like a vineyard. And perhaps, unfortunately, for the European who was arguing with me about whether we had natural wine yeast or naturally occurring wine yeast, another thing that we know about yeast genetics, now that we have we are able to look at the whole yeast genome, is that if you look in the upper right-hand corner here, all of the yeast that are happy making grapes and wine are pretty much all related. 95% of them all come from the same pool. The other groups that you see here are things like the bioprocessing group, or things that we find in dairy or in other fermented processes. And then we have a natural group from North and South America in the lower left-hand corner, and a natural group from the Old World in the lower right-hand corner. And none of the yeast in those two natural groups do a very good job of fermenting grape juice to a delicious wine, at least. So another group in Europe has actually done a study similar to what Katie Heime and her group did, and found that while there are natural yeast in the Old World in Europe, they also are not very happy fermenting wine. In fact, we didn't start to see, well, there are ways we can look at the ancestry of the yeast by actually looking at their genetic code. When we start to look at the age of some of pretty much all of the yeast that we're using to make wine and also to make sake, they all come from common ancestry, and that common ancestry pretty much didn't show up until humans did. So what we suspect now is that these yeast actually developed, sort of co-evolved with the process of fermented beverage production. So is that a natural yeast? It doesn't exist in nature. It didn't exist in nature. It had to have human intervention before we sort of domesticated it, although we can't technically use the word domestication. So we actually are just the same state in North America that they were in Europe hundreds of years ago, where we're potentially at the beginning phases of developing our own yeasts that are happy within our own wineries, if we don't do a whole lot of bringing in of commercial yeast strains from time to time. Interesting argument. By the way, all of these yeasts that are happy in the grape and wine group, they all share the ability to withstand copper and also to withstand higher levels of SO2. Pretty much all of the other yeasts that in the other branches tend to be really adverse to either of these things. So you can see how that was those were adaptations that were forced upon them by human use. And we do know from archaeology and other studies that these wine and sake happy strains were first found in the Caucasus region, about the area where we were first looking at organized wine production, then moved through the Roman and Greek world, and then into Europe. The only question mark at this point is how they got to Asia, because there's some sharing of genes that doesn't make sense from a timeline point of view. But we have pretty good evidence that all of the yeast strains that we like were not originally hanging out on a tree somewhere, but sort of mutated over time in order to take advantage of winemaking. One strain that I think is really interesting that you might like to know about is EC1118, which is one that's quite common, but also is one that is very frequently studied. And when they looked at the genetic code of EC1118, they found that there were some really interesting little snippets of genetic information that were within the genetic code that had clearly been borrowed by Zygosaccharomyces bailey, which is a spoilage yeast that really doesn't worry about high sugar very much. It can handle really high sugar concentration. And Torulaspora, and the Torulaspora, which is now available commercially for fermentation, has a pretty high tolerance to SO2. So the Saccharomyces cerevisiae quite blatantly borrowed genetic code from both of these two other strains, completely outside the family, in order to grab these basically things that would help it to survive in the winemaking area. Another thing that is under investigation right now, in fact, there was a really important paper that was published in Cell in the last year, and if you are interested in that, I'd be glad to send it to you, where Linda Bisson at UC Davis has found that this gene borrowing doesn't just happen between yeast. There's actually some strong evidence that yeast that we're using in wine fermentation, the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, is able in some instances to borrow genetic information from bacteria. And unfortunately for us, it's often borrowing this genetic information from bacteria like Pediococcus gamnosus and other spoilage bacteria that we don't necessarily want in our wine. And the information that it's grabbing from these bacteria allow it to stop using glucose as a food, to stop converting glucose into alcohol, and instead start using other sugar sources, which yeast, under normal circumstances, absolutely cannot do. The yeast really sort of hampers itself by only being able to use glucose. That's why we get stuck fermentation sometimes when we run out of glucose and just have fructose. But they're finding that in some spontaneous fermentations, the yeast and bacteria are finding it mutually beneficial if the yeast aren't using up all that glucose really fast, but are also using other sugar sources. So both the yeast and the bacteria live longer because they're not basically alcoholizing, adding alcohol to their environment at the same clip. So spontaneous fermentations with indigenous mixed cultures that tend to go on for months and months and months probably are the result of this genetic borrowing. And if you get this yeast in your wine, you have the potential for some stuck fermentation, or at least a very slow one, which is interesting. We need to know more about before we can decide how we're going to approach that. So, micro-terroir or not? Is it terroir? Is it something we need to worry about? Is it okay to use whatever yeast will give you the best fermentation? I don't know, that's up to you. But another area of a philosophical discussion where if we understand the science, we can make better decisions about. Excuse me. So just a quick note. I'm trying not to look at the chat box because that distracts me a little bit, but I did notice something come across about typicity and whether non-typicity is a detriment or not. When we're tasting wine for quality, we tend to talk about typicity as a measurable category or a measurable attribute, right? And it says a lot of, this is typical to Sauvignon Blanc, this has got nice typicity for Le Crescent, this has the cherry that I'm looking for typically in a Frontenac. But in judging, do we care? I've judged lots of competitions. I'm sure many of you have too. And as you know, the discussion is often, well, here's a flight of Sauvignon Blanc. This is acceptable because it has typical Sauvignon Blanc, but that isn't often the wine that you give the award to. In fact, a writer at Wine Enthusiast magazine said, we don't award points for typicity. It's not one of the checkoff lists that we have. Our tasting director has said we should not be rewarding wines for being true to type, that is, exhibiting typicity, but for being extraordinary examples of type, which, by definition, is atypical. So are we going for typicity? Do we want to define typicity so that we can then say, that's what the average things are doing, and we are above average. We're super awesome. Maybe. But that certainly throws a ring, another variable in the hat that we have to deal with. So as we get ready for questions, I would leave you with this thought. We are in an area where we sort of have AVAs in the U.S. We don't have AOCs or DOCs like they do in the EU, but our AVAs are really just based on geography. So I don't think that our AVA definition is going to have as strong, going forward, of a connection to typicity as we see in Europe, which again is both a handicap and also an opportunity for those of us who are in these newer wine regions. We have some power to try to move and adjust the definition of both typicity and of how terroir affects our typicity, or whether our typicity expresses our terroir. We can start with maps like this, soils and climates of the U.S., and start to see what looks good, start to decide what we as a group think we want to do. But the sooner we do that, as organized groups and as a voting bloc, I guess is what I'm trying to say, the better off we'll be, because typicity definitions are things that are mutable, but trying to move them is sort of like trying to move a battleship once we have got a definition stuck in consumers and wine writers' heads. So we see that certainly right now where in the Finger Lakes, where we are selling lots of dry Rieslings, we still have a whole lot of consumers who think all Rieslings are sweet, because that is the definition of a typical Riesling that they grew up with as a child or as an uninformed, early in their wine drinking career. So being vocal about the best ways to make the wine, getting together and talking about the best way to make the wine, and what characteristics we're trying to promote or not, both behind the scenes and in talking to your customers, are probably the best way to sort of hedge your bets and start developing a definition that's acceptable to the wine writers before the wine writers write it for you. So I'll leave you with the original definitions that we thought about. Is typicity the degree to which a wine reflects its varietal origins? Is it sort of a typical of type, typical of cultivar? Or is typicity the combination of factors, including soil, climate, and season, that impart sensory characteristics to a wine? Is typicity independent from terroir? Or is typicity entirely dependent on terroir? Or is it somewhere in between? And what do you want to do about it, I guess, is the question. How do you want to approach that question? So again, I didn't give you any good answers. I just gave you some points of thought, I think. And if we were doing this again in person, I probably would have you taste a bunch of wines blind from different regions, and we could all argue about whether they are typical or not and why they were or why they weren't. But we will save that for the MGGA CCC meeting, and I'm going to open this up for questions. Chrislyn, do you have a list and you want to read them for me, or you want me to scroll back?
I can read them. There was, there was a lot of discussion kind of about the difference between stylistic choices and typicity, and like Mark Hart commented that he doesn't really like to see a lot of regulation on what typicity is, in terms of to get the typicity, how the grapes are grown and how the wine is made. But I think that was more comment stuff, and so we did.
Could I address that, though?
Yes, you can.
Because thank you. That is exactly the kind of discussion that I think we need to be having. And so I'm glad. Like I said, I was having trouble drawing my eyes away from the comment box, which is why I kept pausing, because it was just a little too exciting over there. But yeah, we need to talk about that. I mean, I think that it's pretty clear at this point, I would say to all of us, that we are never going to have the kind of limitations in the U.S. that they do in the EU unless they're self-imposed. So things like, well, in California, you're not, or let's think of the Meritage example. So if you want to put Meritage on your wine bottle, you have to join the Meritage Society. You have to agree to just use X number of grapes, or this certain collection of grapes, and so on and so forth. And those restrictions are designed to be a marketing tool, right? If everybody knows what Meritage is, if they push that definition hard enough, then you know what you're getting within reason, or within a range when you're getting that bottle of Meritage. I don't know how well that works. How many people know that Meritage has these limitations? Only the geekiest of wine geeks, in my experience. But there are some examples of this sort of self-imposed limitations. So federally, statewide, it's probably going to be wide open. Now, the problem with that is that when people are trying to learn about wine just because they're ignorant, they're new to it, or when people are trying to learn about new wines, they want the crutches and the shortcuts. And so they're looking for somebody to tell them, this is what Frontenac Rosé is like. This is what sparkling Le Crescent is like, right? So that's where I think we have it both potentially could be shot in the foot if some really influential wine writer comes in and says, well, they all taste like this, and we sort of have to change people's minds about that description, or if we as a group get together and try to define the style, it may be only as useful as the Meritage example, potentially not very useful, but it may also sort of help you, I don't know, kind of go around, that discussion. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
And nobody can answer my question, but that's what I'm thinking.
And then Whitney had a question that kind of really dovetails nicely from what you were just talking about, and said, does typicity evolve with time according to prevailing attitudes and trends?
I would say absolutely typicity evolves with time, at least in the traditional way that we have developed it, because what we've seen, like with the Chablis or with any old world wine that we have got descriptions of since 1920, when the Brits started drinking lots of wines from all over the world. All of those traditional notions come over time and have evolved as such. There's no studies were done to decide what a typical Burgundy red tasted like, right? It's just people tasting it and writing about it, and the folks back home who couldn't go taste all of them but were reading the writing and had one or two said, oh, this is in the realm of what a typical Burgundy is. So I think those sort of age or things that descriptions that have developed over time are especially interesting when you look at the way we train sommeliers. I'm not going to go into that now, but that traditional understanding versus what's actually happening in the world doesn't always match up, and that makes it hard when you're trying to learn, what's the style for this region? Well, it's constantly evolving, so that makes it hard to identify, right?
Okay, and then Kathy Jo asked a question. She would just like to know what the typicity of Marquette is.
I don't know. No one's done a study on, so I did that early study on Frontenac like in 2008. So we have a lexicon, we have one lexicon from 9 wines developed for Frontenac. I think there have been other studies that haven't necessarily been published since, so there'll be more scientific data for that. Murley, Darmatakari at Iowa looked at Le Crescent and Frontenac Gris, although note of caution, all of those were small studies with a select group of wines. Marquette, all of the information, I actually meant to mention this during my talk. I went online and tried to look for descriptors, like our wine writers saying, oh, Marquette is typically, Frontenac is typically, Brianna is blah, blah, blah. I didn't find it. Everything led back to the descriptions that were published either at the University of Minnesota's webpage for the 4 grape cultivars that were released from there, or from other, breeders' web pages, or folks who were, the group that was pushing Elmer Swanson's wine grapes, because Swanson wasn't writing those descriptions himself. So pretty much all of the wine descriptions, the typicity descriptions for the 4 University of Minnesota wine grapes were the result of me sitting down with Peter Hempstead and Jim Luby and tasting with a small group of other people and us sort of deciding. So there's your typicity group, guys. I did it with some friends who were all closely involved in the project. That's a great starting point, but that's not a broad sweep. So Marquette, Marquette has moderate tannins, depending on how you produce it. It's usually oaked because that's how people have traditionally made it in the 10 years that it's been around. And it has lower acid than Frontenac. So it's moderate acid and has some nice cooked fruit notes. That's my description. Is that typical? I don't know. Maybe different in Vermont.
All right. Well, we did have a couple more questions come in, but I think that we do need to wrap things up because we are a little bit over time, and I know people have places to get.
Sorry.
And I have some important. No, it's fine. And I have some announcements I want to make before we start losing too many people. So with that, Anna Katherine, thanks so much. It was very interesting. I definitely learned a lot since I'm not at all in the enology side of things. So it was great. I'm sure our audience learned a lot too, and the discussion in the chat pod was really great. So thanks everybody who contributed to that. First big note, the Northern Grapes Project End of Survey is going to be released soon. If you were involved with the project from the start, you know that we did a baseline survey of the industry that gave us a lot of really good data about the size of the Northern grape and wine industry. There were several reports released, some that looked at the vineyard side as a whole, the wine side as a whole, and then there were also reports generated for individual states. So now that the project is going to be ending soon here in late August, it's time for us to do our end of project survey so we can get an idea of how much the industry has grown during the years that the Northern Grapes Project has been running. So you will very likely be getting an email about this end of project survey inviting you to participate, and I urge you very strongly to please do so. This data is very useful to us. So please, please, please take the survey if you get an email asking you to do so. Also, the list of our upcoming webinars. We have 4 more left this year. The next one will be on February 9th with Bill Gartner and Dan McCole at Michigan State, and they'll be talking about branding and best management practices for cold hardy wines and wineries. So look for an email from me with more information about that coming up in about a week or so. Finally, February 24th, 2016 is the last Northern Grape Symposium. It's titled Super Hardy Grape Cultivars, an option for Michigan and the Upper Midwest. You can get to the schedule for the day. The talks going on during the day are listed below on the screen. And if you want more information about the conference, I have posted information about it on both the project website and our Facebook page, or you can go directly to the michiganwines.com/conference website. So with that, I think we are done. Again, thanks Anna Katherine, and thanks to everyone in the audience. This is a great webinar. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.